Major Alexei Morozov arrived at the Tyazhny 19 facility by Mi-8 helicopter at 2:30 p.m., when the winter sun was already setting and the temperature had dropped to -32°C. The facility was located 180 kilometers from the nearest settlement, in a permafrost zone surrounded by large forest that stretched in all directions, devoid of any sign of human presence. The facility didn't exist on any map. Officially, it was a geological station closed in 1968. In reality, it was a classified research facility of the Ministry of Defense, operating under the designation Anomalous Phenomena Program. The helicopter landed in a cleared area in front of a complex of 4 concrete barracks and a central building housing a radio tower. Morozov emerged, dragging a metal case containing documentation equipment, and immediately noticed that Lieutenant Colonel Semyonov, who was greeting him, wasn't making eye contact. Semyonov was the expedition leader, an experienced field officer who, 3 years earlier, had led a study of anomalous background radiation in Kazakhstan and submitted a report approved by the center. But now, Semyonov looked like a man who hadn't slept for days and had lost confidence in his own ability to assess the situation. "Major Morozov, welcome to the facility," Semyonov said formally, extending his hand. "I hope the flight went smoothly. We need to talk before you inspect the site." Morozov had been sent here after the failure in Novosibirsk, where he had classified the strange seismic anomalies as the result of faulty measuring equipment. A month later, it was discovered that the anomalies were real and had preceded the underground collapse that destroyed the laboratory and killed 3 employees. He wasn't officially punished. He was simply transferred to peripheral facilities with the explanation that analytical procedures require a reassessment. This was his last chance to prove his competence and return to the center. The administrative barracks smelled of damp, kerosene from the heaters, and something else, sour, organic, wrong. Semyonov led Morozov into the office, closed the door, and pulled out a folder marked Top Secret. "The official goal of the expedition is to study anomalous electromagnetic phenomena recorded by satellite sensors 3 months ago," Semyonov began, laying out maps and printouts on the table. "We arrived 6 weeks ago, set up the equipment, and began measurements. For the first 2 weeks, everything was within expectations: weak magnetic anomalies, possibly related to iron ore deposits. But then deviations began." "What kind?" Morozov asked, opening his notebook. "The equipment is functioning properly, the calibrations are correct, but the readings are changing. Not by chance, not due to external factors. They are changing in response to our actions." Semyonov paused, waiting for a reaction. Morozov wrote, "The readings change in response to the personnel's actions, subjective interpretation or genuine correlation." He knew that researchers at isolated sites often begin to see patterns where none exist, create narratives from random coincidences, and attribute intentions to impersonal processes. This was a well-known problem in the psychology of fieldwork. "Give me a specific example," Morozov said. "We installed seismic sensors along the perimeter of a 200 by 200 meter site," Semyonov explained, pointing to the map. "The sensors record microscopic vibrations in the ground. During the first week, the background level was stable. Then we began drilling an exploratory borehole in the center of the site. As drilling began, all the sensors simultaneously recorded a pulse, not from the drilling rig, but from a direction opposite the drilling rig. As if something had reacted to the sound of the drill. Coincidence, Morozov said. Or secondary resonance in the ground? We thought so too. We repeated the experiment 3 days later. The same result, a pulse from the opposite direction at the start of drilling. They repeated this 5 more times at different points along the site. Each time, the pulse came from a direction opposite to the noise source. Morozov wrote this down, already formulating explanations. Perhaps the geological structure was creating an acoustic reflection. Perhaps the sensors were installed incorrectly. Perhaps the data analysis contained a systemic error. All of these explanations were more plausible than the assumption that something underground was reacting to their actions. "Show me the site," Morozov said, closing his notebook. "I want to inspect the sensor installation and check the calibration." They left the barracks and walked along the packed snow road to the research site. The sun had almost touched the horizon. The temperature was dropping rapidly. The air was still and absolutely silent, that kind of Siberian silence that oppresses the ears with its completeness. Morozov noticed that the technicians working on the site moved stiffly, frequently glancing over their shoulders, and staying closer to each other than the job required. The site was. It was a cleared area with 12 metal tripods with sensors installed around its perimeter. In the center stood a drilling rig, a small one, designed for exploratory drilling to depths of up to 50 meters. Next to the drill was a canvas shelter, under which were the data recording and recording devices. Morozov approached the nearest sensor, checked the mounting, and inspected the cables. Everything was installed correctly, professionally, with no visible defects. He opened the case containing his own equipment, took out a portable analyzer, and connected it to the recording system. "Start the drill," he ordered the technician at the rig. The technician looked at Semyonov, seeking confirmation. Semyonov nodded. The technician started the engine, and the drill began to rotate and plunge into the frozen ground. The sound was loud, mechanical, shattering the silence. Morozov stared at the analyzer screen, monitoring the readings from the 12 sensors. The first 10 seconds of data were as expected, vibrations from the drilling rig propagating through the ground. Then, at the 11th second, all sensors on the opposite side of the site simultaneously registered a pulse, short, sharp, and directional. Morozov checked the timestamps. The pulse occurred 10.7 seconds after the start of drilling, on all sensors simultaneously, with millisecond accuracy. This ruled out chance. A random pulse couldn't be synchronous at such a distance without a common cause. He ordered the drill to stop, waited a minute, and then ordered it to restart. The result was the same, at the 11th second, a pulse from the opposite direction. Morozov stood in the cold, looking at the data, and realized he had to make a decision, classify this as an unexplained anomaly, requiring an immediate report to the center and a halt to field work until specialists arrived, or continue the investigation, collect more data, and find a rational explanation before raising the alarm. The first option was safe, but it meant admitting he couldn't explain the anomaly again, requesting help again, and demonstrating his incompetence again. The second option offered a chance to find an explanation, present a full analysis, and prove his worth. He chose the second option. It was a mistake, but he didn't yet know how much. Continue taking measurements according to standard protocol, Morozov said. I'll install additional sensors tomorrow morning. I want to get a three-dimensional picture of the pulse's propagation. If we find the source, we'll find an explanation. Semyonov nodded, but his expression betrayed doubt. They returned to the barracks when darkness was already complete and the temperature had dropped to -37. The next morning, Morozov installed 6 additional sensors, not only seismic, but also magnetic, temperature, and infrared. He wanted to record any physical change that could explain the pulses. The work took 4 hours in freezing temperatures that seared his lungs with every breath and made metal tools dangerous to bare hands. By midday, the system was ready. Morozov launched a series of tests, drilling at different points, at different depths, with different intervals. Each time, the result was identical. 10 to 11 seconds after the start of drilling, a pulse from the opposite direction occurred. But now, additional sensors were registering something else. The ground temperature at the pulse point increased by 0.3 degrees, the magnetic field changed by 0.02 milliteslas, and infrared sensors detected weak radiation. These changes were real and measurable, but they had no known physical mechanism. Ground temperature cannot increase locally without a heat source. Magnetic fields cannot change without the movement of magnetic materials or electrical currents. Infrared radiation does not arise out of thin air. Morozov double-checked all the equipment. The calibrations were correct. The sensors were functioning properly. The data was real. He had violated protocol by failing to immediately report the unexplained physical changes. Protocol required reporting to headquarters any anomalies that didn't fit known patterns. But Morozov convinced himself he needed more data, that a premature report would cause panic, that he had to find an explanation before attracting attention. On the third day, the first disappearance occurred. Technician Volkov went to check the sensors on the north side of the site at 6 in the evening, when it was already dark. He was supposed to return in 30 minutes. He didn't return. An hour later, Semyonov organized a search. Volkov was found 200 meters from the site, sitting in the snow near a tree, hatless, mittens missing, eyes open, alive but unresponsive. They carried him to the barracks, warmed him up, and attempted to speak to him. Volkov stared into space, breathing, blinking, but didn't answer questions, didn't respond to commands, and showed no signs of awareness. His pulse was slow, 40 beats per minute instead of the normal 70. His body temperature was 34 degrees Celsius. The expedition's medic, Captain Sokolov, examined Volkov, and found no physical injuries. There were no injuries, no signs of frostbite, despite spending at least an hour in the freezing cold without protection. Sokolov measured his brain activity with a portable electroencephalograph. The readings were abnormal. The wave pattern was slow and regular, inconsistent with sleep, wakefulness, or coma. "What's wrong with him?" Morozov asked. "I don't know," Sokolov answered honestly. Physiologically, he's functioning. His metabolism is slow, but not critically. His brain is active, but the activity pattern. I've never seen anything like it. It's as if he's neither asleep nor awake, but in some in-between state. Morozov should have immediately stopped all work and requested medical evacuation. This was protocol for serious medical incidents. But requesting evacuation meant reporting the cause, it meant explaining what had happened, it meant admitting the situation was out of control. Instead, Morozov decided to continue. He convinced himself that Volkov had simply been exposed to the cold and gone into shock, that his condition was stable and didn't require immediate evacuation, and that halting work due to a single incident would be an overreaction. Keep him under observation, Morozov ordered Sokolov. Continue monitoring his indicators. If his condition worsens, notify me immediately. That night, the equipment began producing inconsistent data. The sensors registered pulses without any external stimulus, no drilling, no noise, no personnel action. The pulses appeared spontaneously, every 8 to 10 minutes, with a regularity that couldn't be random. Morozov sat in the monitoring room, watching the screens, recording the data. The pulses were directional. They didn't originate from a single point, but came from different directions, as if the source were moving underground. But the seismic sensors didn't register any movement. There were no vibrations characteristic of a moving object. The pulses simply appeared in different locations without any transfer between them. This was physically impossible. Objects cannot teleport. Energy cannot appear in one place, disappear, and reappear in another without a transfer process. On the fourth day, Morozov redoubled his efforts instead of retreating. He ordered the drill hole to be deepened to 30 meters, underground sensors installed, and a tomographic scan of the soil performed. He wanted to find a physical source, a material explanation, something he could document and present as a rational anomaly. Drilling had reached 28 meters when the incident occurred. The drill suddenly stopped, jammed in the ground. Attempts to extract it failed. The drill was jammed with a force the drilling rig could not overcome. Then the sensors registered a series of pulses, not individual ones, but successive, rapid ones, coming from all directions simultaneously, as if something were surrounding the area. The technicians working on the site stopped, looking at each other with growing panic. One of them, Junior Sergeant Petrov, shouted, "It's here! It's all around us!" and ran toward the barracks. Morozov tried to restore order, shouting commands, but the panic spread. 2 more technicians dropped their tools and followed Petrov. Semyonov tried to stop them, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the drilling rig and the shouts. Morozov made a decision that he thought would restore control. He ordered an immediate halt to all operations, the evacuation of all personnel from the site, and the establishment of a security perimeter. He thought this would calm the crew, give them time to reassess the situation. Instead, his decision made the situation irreversible. Because even after everyone left the site and turned off the equipment, the pulses didn't stop. They intensified. The personnel gathered in the main barracks, 18 of them in a state ranging from anxiety to outright panic. Volkov was still lying on his cot in the medical bay, in the same unresponsive state. Petrov and 2 other technicians refused to leave the barracks, demanding immediate evacuation. Semyonov tried to restore discipline, but his authority had been undermined by weeks of mounting anomalies. Morozov realized he had lost control of the expedition. Orders no longer held any force because people no longer believed anyone understood what was happening. When personnel distrust their leadership, discipline breaks down not through open disobedience but through passive resistance, through an unwillingness to carry out tasks, through a collective decision that self-preservation is more important than subordination. That night, Morozov couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot, listening to the wind outside and the thumping of the heaters, and thought about how he had brought the situation to this point. Every decision he made was defensible at the moment it was made: continue the research, collect more data, avoid raising the alarm prematurely. But the sequence of defensible decisions led to a situation that was now completely uncontrollable. On the morning of the 5th day, a discovery occurred that explained much and made everything worse. Sokolov, checking the medical records in the archives. At the facility, I found documents that were not mentioned in the official briefing. The documents dated back to 1968, the last year the facility officially functioned as a geological station. The documents described a previous expedition, a 12-person team that had conducted research into the same electromagnetic anomalies. The documents described the same phenomena: pulses responding to personnel actions, a gradual escalation of activity, and changes in personnel behavior. The last entry was dated November 3, 1968, and read, "Ceasing all operations. Evacuation impossible due to weather conditions. Personnel are showing signs of psychological disorientation. Closure of facility and classification of the area as a hazardous area are recommended." After this entry, the archive ended. The official explanation for the facility's closure was insufficient funding and lack of scientific interest. There was no mention of anomalies or safety recommendations in the official documents. Morozov realized they'd been sent here with knowledge of the previous incident, knowing the situation was dangerous, but without warning them of the true nature of the risk. Perhaps the center wanted to test whether the phenomenon would recur, wanted to collect more data with more modern equipment, or wanted to use the expedition as an experiment without informing the participants. He showed the documents to Semyonov. Semyonov read them silently, then said, "They knew. They sent us here knowing it was dangerous. We are not researchers. We are test subjects." This information spread instantly among the staff. The reaction was predictable: anger, fear, demands for immediate evacuation. Morozov gathered the staff, tried to restore order, and explained that even if the center had concealed the information, their professional duty was to complete the mission and submit a full report. No one listened. Trust was completely shattered. Petrov openly declared that he refused to follow any orders and would await evacuation in the barracks. 5 technicians supported him. Semyonov was unable or unwilling to force them to obey. Morozov made a choice that he believed would restore control. He decided to personally descend into the borehole on a rope, install sensors at depth, and obtain direct measurements from the source of the anomaly. He thought his personal example of courage would inspire the staff, and that concrete data from the depths would provide an explanation that would reassure everyone. Semyonov tried to dissuade him. "Major, this won't restore trust. It will simply expose you to a danger we don't understand." But Morozov was adamant. He donned safety gear, attached a flashlight and portable sensors, and ordered 2 technicians to prepare the winch. The technicians complied reluctantly, slowly, with expressions on their faces that suggested they considered this suicide. The borehole was 30 meters deep, 40 centimeters in diameter, and its walls lined with metal pipe. Morozov began his descent on a rope, the flashlight illuminating a narrow cylinder receding into the darkness. The temperature dropped as they descended, -35 degrees on the surface. It should have been warmer below due to the geothermal gradient, but instead it grew colder. At a depth of 15 meters, Morozov felt a change. Not physical, not measurable by instruments, but definitely real, a feeling of being watched from somewhere below. He tried to dismiss it as a psychological reaction to stress and confined space. At a depth of 20 meters, his flashlight began to flicker. The batteries were new, fully charged, but the light was fading. The sensors he carried began showing conflicting data. The temperature was falling and rising simultaneously on different sensors. The magnetic field was fluctuating at an impossible frequency. At a depth of 25 meters, the cable stopped. Morozov shouted upstairs to continue the descent. There was no response. He tugged on the cable. It was taut, motionless. He hung in the darkness 5 meters above the bottom of the borehole, unable to ascend or descend. Then he felt a vibration in the cable. Not from the winch above, but from something else. The vibration was rhythmic, regular, like a pulse. And with each pulse, the temperature dropped, the light from the lantern dimmed, and the feeling of being watched intensified to such an extent that Morozov was absolutely certain something was down there, knew he was there, and was reacting to his presence. His choice to descend had made the situation irreversible, because now whatever was down there knew them not simply as sources of noise and vibration on the surface, but as separate consciousnesses capable of deliberate action. Morozov hung in the shaft for 14 minutes before the cable began to rise. During those 14 minutes, he experienced something he couldn't adequately describe even to himself, not visions, not voices, not physical contact, but a transmission of information directly into his consciousness, without the use of his senses. He realized, not through words or images but through the knowledge that simply appeared in his mind, that what lay beneath the sight was sentient. Not in the sense of a human mind, not in the sense of consciousness as he understood it, but in the sense of a system that perceived, remembered, and responded with intent. He realized it had been there for a long time, perhaps centuries, perhaps millennia. That it had existed in a dreamlike state until the vibrations of human activity began to awaken it. That every drilling, every installation of equipment, every noise was like touching a sleeping creature that was slowly awakening and becoming aware of the presence of something else on the surface above. He realized it was attempting to communicate, not through language, not through symbols, but through patterns, through rhythm, through changes in the physical environment that were the only way it could influence the world above. The impulses were not random reactions, but attempts to establish contact, to communicate its existence, to learn what kind of beings were above. And he realized the most terrifying thing: it wasn't hostile, but its attempts at communication were dangerous because the method it used, direct transmission of information to the nervous system, overloaded the human brain, slowed metabolism, and relegated consciousness to the state Volkov was in, a state where a person was open to receiving information but no longer functioned as an independent being. When Morozov was brought to the surface, he couldn't speak for half an hour. He simply sat in the snow, shivering, trying to process what he'd learned. Semyonov and Sokolov stood nearby, waiting for an explanation. Finally, Morozov managed to formulate the words, "It's intelligent. It's trying to communicate. And every attempt we make to study it makes it try harder, which makes us like Volkov." Semyonov looked at him with an expression that was a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Are you serious? Are you telling me there's an intelligent being down there that communicates with us through seismic impulses? It's not talking. It's communicating. No words, no symbols, no concepts we can translate. But yes, it's aware of us and trying to establish contact." Sokolov asked a practical question: "Can we stop it? Can we force it to stop?" Morozov didn't know the answer. He thought the only way to stop communication was to stop all the actions that were stimulating it, stop drilling, remove the equipment, leave the site entirely. But he also realized from the information he'd received that the awakening process was now irreversible. It had awakened, was aware of the presence of humans, and even if they left the site, it would continue to try to reach them. That evening, betrayal occurred. Petrov and the 4 technicians who had refused to work decided to act independently. They took a radio, contacted the center directly, bypassing the command structure, and reported that the expedition had encountered an incomprehensible phenomenon, that command had lost control, and that the personnel were demanding immediate evacuation. Morozov learned of this when the center contacted him demanding an explanation. The voice on the other end was cold and formal. "Major Morozov, we have received an unauthorized message from your personnel. Explain the situation." Morozov attempted to give a coherent report, but his words seemed inadequate to describe what was happening. He spoke of a sentient anomaly, of nonverbal communication, of personnel entering altered states of consciousness. The more he spoke, the more he realized how it sounded, like the delirium of someone who had lost touch with reality. The response from the center was predictable: "Major, you will be relieved of command. Lieutenant Colonel Semyonov will assume temporary leadership. The expedition will be evacuated within 48 hours. You will remain at the facility to meet with the special commission that will arrive to investigate." Morozov realized his career was over. His second failure was final. But worse than the professional consequences was the realization that the center didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, the true nature of the situation, that the commission would arrive with the same assumptions and methods that had led to the crisis, that the cycle would repeat itself. That night, Volkov's condition changed. His pulse slowed to 20 beats per minute. His body temperature dropped to 30 degrees. But the electroencephalograph showed not a decrease in activity but a change in it. The wave pattern became more organized, more structured, resembling a signal rather than noise. Sokolov called Morozov into the medical bay. They stood over Volkov, looking at the instrument readings, and Morozov realized what was happening. Volkov wasn't dying or slipping into a coma. He was becoming a conduit, an interface between what lay below and the world above. His nervous system tuned to a communication frequency that others perceived only as overload. "It's using him," Morozov said quietly. "It's learning to communicate through it, learning to translate its patterns into forms the human brain can process without destruction." "We have to stop this," Sokolov said. "How?" "Disable it." "Is he off life support?" "He's breathing on his own. He's not on a machine. He's just changed." They didn't know what to do. There were no protocols for this situation. The evacuation began the next morning. The helicopter could carry 6 people per flight, and 4 flights were required to evacuate all personnel. The first group included Petrov and the technicians who had raised the alarm. They flew away without looking back. Morozov remained with Semyonov, Sokolov, and 2 technicians to await the final flight. Volkov was placed in a heated and monitored transport container, prepared for evacuation despite the fact that no one knew how medical facilities would respond to his condition. During the 2 hours of waiting, the pulses from the site increased dramatically. The sensors that remained active recorded continuous activity, not individual pulses, but a constant vibration, a pattern that changed and adapted, as if whatever was below was trying to find a frequency where it could be heard. When the helicopter returned for the last group, Sokolov noticed Volkov open his eyes. For the first time in 6 days, Volkov showed signs of conscious awareness. He looked at Morozov, his lips moving, forming words without making a sound. Morozov moved closer, trying to understand what Volkov was saying. The movements of his lips were slow and exaggerated, as if Volkov was relearning how to use his speech apparatus. Finally, Morozov made out the words, "It wants to know. It wants to understand. It is alone." Those were the only words Volkov uttered before closing his eyes again and returning to a state of unresponsiveness. The helicopter took off, carrying the last group out of the facility. Morozov looked down at the research site, at the sensors and the drilling rig, at the barracks that would be sealed and abandoned. The center would declare the area closed to research, classify the documents, and history would repeat itself in a few decades when a new generation decided that previous warnings had been exaggerated. A special commission arrived a week later. Morozov was interrogated for 3 days, demanding an explanation for his decisions, his interpretation of the data, and his failure to prevent the crisis. He provided a full report, including his experiences in the borehole, information about the sentient nature of the anomaly, and his theory about nonverbal communication. The Commission classified his report as evidence of psychological disorientation caused by the stress of isolation and professional pressure. The official conclusion was that the Tyazhny 19 facility was experiencing unexplained geophysical anomalies requiring further investigation by a specialized team, that Major Morozov had demonstrated poor judgment in crisis management, and that the site should be temporarily sealed until new research protocols could be developed. Morozov was transferred to an administrative position in Moscow, with no field duties and no access to classified projects. This was a polite form of exile. He remained in the system but without the ability to influence anything significant. Volkov was placed in a specialized medical facility where his condition was monitored but not understood. His metabolism stabilized at an abnormally low level. His brain activity remained in a pattern that didn't correspond to any known state of consciousness. He lived, breathed, and functioned physiologically, but never regained the ability to communicate or interact normally. The Tyazhny 19 facility was sealed in the winter of 1979. The barracks were mothballed, the equipment left in place, and the area was surrounded by a perimeter with warning signs about radiation hazards, a lie intended to deter casual travelers. But the pulses didn't stop. Satellite sensors continued to record electromagnetic anomalies in the area, patterns that grew more complex over the years, becoming more organized, more like a signal trying to reach a recipient who had never learned to listen. In the KGB archives, there is a file marked Special Importance containing 27 documents covering the period from 1968 to 1991. Each document describes an attempt to investigate or explain the anomalies of the Tyazhny 19 facility. Each attempt ends with the same recommendation: seal the area, classify the information, and avoid further contact. The final document is dated December 1991, a few days before the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is a memorandum written by an unidentified author, addressed to no one in particular, perhaps simply kept for archival purposes. Some questions have no answers we can understand. Some forms of existence do not fit into the categories we have created to organize reality. What do we do when confronted with intelligence so different from human that the very concept of communication becomes meaningless? How do we distinguish between the impossible and the incomprehensible? The area remains sealed not because we know what's there, but because we don't know and cannot know, and this uncertainty, worse than any specific horror. Morozov lived another 34 years, working in administrative positions, retiring in 2001 and dying in 2013 at the age of 78. He never returned to Siberia, never spoke publicly about the events at the Tyazhny 19 facility. But every year on the anniversary of the evacuation, he checked the satellite data. It was declassified after the collapse of the USSR, and saw that the patterns continued, that whatever lay beneath the frozen ground was still trying to speak, still sending its messages to a world that couldn't or wouldn't listen. The area remains closed to this day. Officially, for environmental reasons. In reality, because no one knows what's there, what it wants, or what would happen if someone tried to respond.